Good morning. I want to start with this reading. It comes from Dr. Martin Luther King. He wrote this. The trouble isn't so much that we don't know enough, but it's as if we aren't good enough. Trouble isn't so much that our scientific genius lags behind, but our moral genius lags behind. The great problem facing modern man is that by the means by which we live have outdistanced the spiritual ends for which we live. So we find ourselves caught in a messed up world. The problem is with man himself and the man's soul, we haven't learned how to be just and honest and kind and true and loving. And that is the basis of our problem. The real problem is that through our scientific genius, we've made of the world a neighborhood. But through our moral and spiritual genius, we failed to make it a brotherhood. Here ends this morning's reading. I've recently read this book called Poverty by America. Now, I want you to notice that title, right? It isn't poverty in America, it's poverty by America. It's a captivating title. I decided to pick it up because my husband Scott was reading various essays by this author and kept saying, oh my God, now that I know this, I can't unknow it. This is how the book is described. This is a book about poverty that is not just about the poor. Instead, it's a book about how the other half lives, about how some lives are made small so that others may grow. I originally dove into this book, not just because of my husband, but because I've always been intrigued by that aspect of Martin Luther King's vision that connected the growing military-industrial complex with racism and materialism and poverty altogether. In particular, though, I have always been interested in his views and thoughts on poverty. It was the mantle King actually was taking up the very end of his life, and he proposed some radical means to get to a more fair and just economic structure. In a speech that he gave in 1966, King explained, there must be a better distribution of wealth, and maybe America must move towards a democratic socialism. So, poverty by America. The very thing that captivated MLK's imagination, heart, voice, feet, and hands. Here's the thing. America is the richest country in the world. Now, we're not one of the richest countries in the world. We are the richest country in the world, and yet we have more poverty than any other advanced democracy. So I knew that was a problem here in the US, but honestly, I didn't know the extent of the problem. And I think what got me even further into investigating this is during the pandemic, I read somewhere that the poverty rate in the US had dropped by half, which, you guys, that's insane, right? Because this was during the worst economic downturn in nearly a century. It fell, and by a lot. The US economy lost millions of jobs during the COVID-19 pandemic, but there was roughly 16 million fewer Americans in poverty in 2021 compared to 2018. And it fell for those who lived in cities or out in the country. It fell for those in their 20s and those in their 70s. It fell across all ethnic groups, but most of all, it dropped for children. And you heard that right. Child poverty was cut in half during the pandemic. So you got to ask the question, how is that true, right? Well, there were generous unemployment benefits alongside stimulus checks, rental assistance, and an expanded child tax credit. Guess what? Now that those programs aren't in full swing anymore, the poverty numbers are back up. Now, you would have thought that there would have been celebration over that drop in poverty. I mean, It's amazing, right? Well, not really. Whole group of people were not celebrating. In fact, there was vocal subset of Americans that were actually kind of upset that the government was doing by putting these pieces in place, in their opinion, was helping people too much. In particular, they blamed that souped up kind of unemployment checks for the nation's sluggish economy. The Wall Street Journal ran an opinion piece that's headline read, "The COVID unemployment relief makes help impossible to find." And reporters all over the country kept finding small business owners who said things like, well, we had employees that still chose to take unemployment and not stay on, which I thought was just unbelievable. I mean, when did people get so lazy? In June and July of 2021, that was the lead theory as to why the economy was sluggish, right? Lazy, poor people. Or another way of saying it a little less harshly is people weren't going back to work because we were paying them to stay home. That was the theory, except it really wasn't true. If you dig into the data, actually, you'll find that there were 25 states that stopped some or all emergency benefits during the pandemic, including expanded unemployment insurance. Now, as Matthew Desmond points out, this created an opportunity to see whether those states actually enjoyed a significant jump in their employment rates. But it turns out there wasn't. No jump. In August of 2021, the Labor Department released its findings. And what we learned was that in who had cut benefits, those states that had cut benefits, and those that had kept them, there was something else going on. Here's what's most interesting. The states that did cut benefits, sometimes all the benefits, along with not experiencing significant job growth, they did, however, experience a decline in consumer spending. And as Desmond notes, since the cuts left their citizens with less money, it slowed actually their local economies. So I think the question has to be asked, what's behind the narrative kind of blaming the state of our country's economics on people just being lazy? Why do we do that? Instead of a more probable answer like, well, maybe they didn't go back to work because they didn't want to get sick and die, or their job was lousy to begin with, or their kids, like schools were closed and they lacked reliable childcare. Perhaps it's because, as Matthew Desmond contends, actually, we've been trained since the earliest days of capitalism to see the poor as idle and unmotivated. We blame so-called welfare moms for the demise of the economy at every turn. But here's the thing. The problem isn't welfare dependency, but welfare avoidance. Many poor families don't take advantage of aid that's available to them. Only a quarter of families who qualify for temporary assistance for needy families even apply for it. Again, you got to ask, why is that, right? Why? We've often thought it may be because there is a stigma attached to asking for it, like a shame that comes over you when you ask for extra help with something. But it turns out that's not it. The problem is the ruling class, the advantaged class, make it difficult to apply for aid and also make it easy to get kicked off of it if you don't apply correctly. There isn't a concerted effort to help people get the resources and money that could help them be more financially stable, which is odd, really. It's not like we don't know how to market an idea in this country. I mean, actually, we're pretty good at marketing an idea or a coupon or a savings in this country. In fact, we're really good at it. If you look at what happens at President's Day or New Year's Day or even Memorial Day coming up, right? There's all these kind of sales going on. We rock at marketing here. So perhaps the answer is that maybe we don't want the poor, working class, or the poor to sign up for the benefits. As Ezra Klein said in this podcast I was listening to, that signing up for these programs is the equivalent of a time tax. It zaps actually in an inordinate amount of time to apply, and then you usually got to like reapply. And when you could be working and making money rather than filling out a form that may or may not be helpful to you, the tax time wins out. The time tax. And the question is that an accident or is it a policy choice? Is it complex because we don't want people to use the benefit, or that we fundamentally don't believe they should use the benefit? Somewhere in there, you guys, is an ouch. Here's the thing. The American poor aren't very good at being welfare dependent. The problem is actually the rest of us, the protected class. Those of us who are not working poor or even outright poor are good at being welfare dependent. In 2020, the federal government spent more than $193 billion. I want you to think of this as like $200 billion, okay? Keep that in your head. For homeowner subsidies, a figure that far exceeded, basically, the $50 billion spent on direct housing assistance for low-income renting families. So I'm going to say that again, right? We as a country have decided it makes sense and is fair to dedicate $193 billion to homeowners and only $53 billion to low-income renters. Or, well, think on this. Desmond says this so well. The lifetime limit for cash welfare to poor parents is 5 years. But families claiming the mortgage interest deduction may do so for the length of the mortgage, which is typically 30 years. The benefit means you have to be able to afford a home to begin with, which most working poor and poor people can't and don't do. So is this benefit fair or unfair? How about another benefit? Perhaps for what we would consider not really for the upper class, but certainly for those of us in the middle class, student loans. On the surface, right, it looks like the bank is who issues the loan, right? But I want you to think about it. What bank in their right mind would lend money to an 18-year-old with no credit history, no job, and no collateral? And the truth is, the bank does lend money to a student, of course, but without the federal government guaranteeing the loans and paying for half of the interest, the banks would never agree to the loan in the first place. Here's another one. Most middle class and upper class folks have some form of a pension, a 401k or an IRA, and they often meet with a financial advisor. And when you meet with a financial advisor, they will tell you when you have kids about to go to college, you should put money into a 529 college savings plan. The plans offer a generous benefit to the taxpayer, and yet costs the federal government about $28 billion over a 10-year period of time. So the more you squirrel away, of course, the bigger that tax benefit. That's why this is used mostly by the well-off. Because if I am working poor or I'm poor, I frequently can't even take advantage of this because most of the time I'm living paycheck to paycheck to paycheck, and even a meager savings of any kind is beyond what I'm able to manage. And friends, there is Sometimes I wish I had a lot more time to just go into all of this, but it's a lot and it's overwhelming. But suffice it to say, the biggest beneficiaries of federal aid by far of welfare, government money, government handouts are affluent families, those who make over $100,000 a year. And here is where it's actually worth circling back to Martin Luther King Jr. I realized something the other day. King was like starting to unmask, if you will, all of this when he was shot, when he was murdered. At the time, he was making similar parallels to that which Matthew Desmond has done, because he had a cutting analysis of increased militarism equals increased poverty. I was bedazzled, and always have been, by his ability to elevate education as the means to really lift individuals and whole groups of people out of poverty. I was struck by his radical ideas about creating job programs from federal monies. Over and over again, I was shook by his brilliance, his ability to connect issues in simple yet complex ways. So you can look at much of his writing. Almost all of it comes off as great policy and programs to be adopted, great political strategies to pursue. But the more I went back and I kept looking at his work, the more I did a wow, because I missed something. If you read him clearly, in his fiery prose and analysis, he isn't saying, hey, let's get together and work toward justice and equality for all. But instead, he said, we may need to die for all of this to make it right. Or to put it another way, he wasn't just calling for better policy, he was calling for sacrifice. And I think this is easy to forget because his ideas are so brilliant, his speech is so eloquent, and thus we can get lost in the intellectualism of it all and forget the parts where he stressed again and again and again that these weren't just cost-efficient ideas, they were ideals that entail a cost. This was such an insight for me, and I was surprised, honestly, that I had missed it. In fact, it made me go back and look at all of his writing with a new lens. And I realized that the uniqueness of his message isn't just in rightly naming the problem of his time and applying the correct salve, but it is how he was honest, bold, and brave enough to admit that it would take sacrifice on his part and everyone else's, especially the comfortable and privileged, in order to get there. So I went back to his I Have a Dream speech, and I read it through with this new lens. And I went to that piece that everybody kind of uses during MLK events, on the weekend in January. And anytime people are talking about him, I want to lift up his ideas on stuff. And I found this one quote that everybody uses all the time. It's this: I have a dream that one day in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, that one day right there in Alabama, little Black boys and little Black girls will be able to join hands with little white girls and little white boys as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. And then, here's the thing. We often fail to read the rest of the speech, or maybe we just want to mentally skip over it because he proposes some hard things. He says a couple paragraphs later, I have faith that we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together. And there it is, isn't it? This isn't just a dream of children walking hand in hand. This is a dream of children being able to walk hand in hand to jail for the sake of what they believe. Realizing that raises the stakes, changes the question, forces us to ask, When was the last time we acted with such a radical commitment that it could land us in jail? He isn't saying it would be easy. He wasn't proclaiming a new day in a simple sense. He was, however, pointing out the hard realities, the sacrifices it would take to get there. I also went back and read excerpts from his book, Stride Towards Freedom with New Eyes. And he notes quite like clearly in hard realities what it really takes to raise like the consciousness of a nation. He says this: American Negroes must come to the point where they can say to their white brothers, paraphrasing the words of Gandhi, bomb our homes and threaten our children, send your hooded perpetrators of violence into our communities and drag us out on some wayside road, beating us and leaving us half dead. And we will still love you, but we will soon wear you down by our capacity to suffer. I also reread the piece that pointed out his everyday reality. In the course of his civil rights work, he was jailed 14 times and stabbed once in the chest. His home was bombed 3 times, and his daily mail brought a steady flow of death threats and obscenities. Undeterred, he worked 20 hours a day, traveled 325,000 miles, and made 400 speeches a year throughout the country on behalf of the cause. So with that new lens, friends, I got to be honest, it feels like a little overwhelming. And I know you may be worrying that I'm heading in the direction of like finger wagging, but that's not it at all. Didn't make me feel like finger wagging at all. It made me more feel like sticking my finger in my ears, like la, 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 la. Because sacrifice, I mean, come on, who wants to talk about that or even think about that, right? I don't. And it makes me hearken back to like George W. Bush, if you remembered what he said during the Iraqi war. I wish I were here with you in the room right now, but do you remember what he said? He told us to do what? Go shopping. I mean, come on, now that's somehow a lot easier. It's easier to go shopping for a new dress rather than take on something hard, commit to something that may take me away from my loved ones, perhaps even put myself in harm's way or be under threat. And as I've reflected on MLK Jr. and his work primarily around poverty, it's made me think a great deal about the great sin that is happening in us today as a culture. And I know many of you know this, but it's worth repeating. We as Unitarian Universalists have a bit of a problem with the concept of original sin. For us, there never was an irredeemable stain on humankind. Instead, we've most often looked at sin as a relational or social category, not as a personal or ontological one. So sin for us is all the social kind of and relational dynamics which separate and divide us from human beings, from each other. So our idea of sin and MLK come together for me because I believe there are many forces in our society that serve to separate us from one another and from ourselves, actually. Many things that make it easy for some portion of our society to not even be aware of the pain and suffering of others, or pervasive poverty, or deteriorating schools, or languishing living wage jobs. And I am positive that Dr. King would lift this up. Not just the sacrifice needed, but also the sin of being caught up in structures and habits and mind frames that separate us from each other. And I'm thinking today that he wouldn't just highlight these 2 topics. I think he would connect the 2 topics. I think he would remind us that they are inextricably bound, tied up together. I think he would remind us that it's through sacrifice that the sin of separation is healed. There's a sports metaphor that some of you know, I'm sure. You're only really considered committed until you have skin in the game. People know you aren't really invested until you're willing to put yourself like at risk. If you're willing to get yourself like bruised and banged up and look a little dented after the game. Which for us in our lives means not just paying lip service to our values and beliefs or showing compassion, but losing some of our privileged skin, if you will. Ironically, Matthew Desmond is saying the same thing in order to end poverty. He says to end poverty, it will require that each of us, in our own way, become poverty abolitionists, unwinding ourselves through a sacrificial giving up of what we are getting from our neighbor's deprivation and refusing to live unwitting enemies of the poor. So with all of that in mind, my imagination has gone into overdrive, asking such things as, what would it mean for you to show up at every town hall meeting where the zoning board is involved and you go to support housing for all, not just those who can afford it? And you know that Fred down the street, Fred, not just those, he's going to like show up and kind of get upset about arguing over having low income housing next to his house because he thinks it will depreciate the value of his own home. And you actually go to those meetings and you say, we have a moral obligation to offer housing for all. And your commitment to making all of those meetings makes you miss your granddaughter's birthday. And maybe it makes you miss, your anniversary as well, because the zoning board meetings are on those same days. But you actually made a commitment because you know that when you come to church, you want to have integrity with your values in alignment with your actions. And that when you look behind the pulpit, there's a big sign that says Black Lives Matter. And you know that 40% of Black children live in poverty. 40%. And those children are part of not just a neighborhood, but a moral web of connection we are called to uphold. Here's another one that I've been going round and round about and starting to meet with some other friends who are thinking about the same thing. Should I consider when I die, instead of acting like I have 3 children, act like I have 4. 4 that are going to inherit my estate, assuming there's going to be some money left over. But do I act like I have 4 children instead of 3, and that 1/4 of that estate goes to an account to help Black families buy a home or pool that money with others to help build inherited wealth? I wonder about that. What if you decided that you weren't going to take the tax benefit on your mortgage interest and instead do something else with it? Which, by the way, is what Matthew Desmond says is the bare minimum of what a socially committed middle and upper class person should do. So what are we left with? Well, I believe it's not just a message about sacrifice, but a much more actually complex message that it is through sacrifice that our separation is healed, but also something more. Community is actually woven all through Dr. King's words. He said he couldn't have gone on without it. None of the sacrifices that he gave would have been possible. None of the resistance, none of the boldness, none of the bravery. So when I get paralyzed by the call to sacrifice, I think of this. His needing community helps clarify my need for it as well. Simply put, healing that divides us does not occur without sacrifice, and sacrifice does not occur without community, without us doing it together, without us becoming poverty abolitionists together. I get that Dr. King's call is intimidating for any of us. You realize immediately that you can't and don't want to do it alone. So I end today not with the message of it's time to finally do it, but I end with the message of it's time for us to finally do it. Time, friends, to create the beloved community he so often called everyone toward. In fact, King went so far as to call it disinterested love, because it is the sort of love that doesn't care whether it is loved back or not. It is the love that will go to any lengths to restore community. Again, healing what divides us does not occur without sacrifice, and sacrifice does not occur without community. Once we get that, like once we totally understand that, I actually then believe we will have listened to Martin correctly. And then maybe we'll not only see the possibility of the promised land, but be able to achieve it. Maybe so. Amen.